In the summer of 1889, deep in the hills of Colorado Territory, a sound would pierce through the morning silence that would haunt rancher Samuel Crawford for the rest of his life. What he discovered beneath 6 feet of rocky soil would challenge everything the people of Millbrook believed about justice, superstition, and the thin line between civilization and barbarism. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drought had lasted 3 months when the accusations began. 15-year-old Elena Hartwell had always been different. While other girls her age in Millbrook spent their time learning needlework and preparing for marriage, Elena could be found wandering the mountainside, collecting herbs and speaking to animals as if they understood every word. Her unusual green eyes and premature silver streak running through her dark hair only added to the whispers that followed her through town. Elena had been living at the Millbrook Orphanage since she was 7, after her parents died in a mining accident that claimed 12 lives. The accident itself had sparked the first rumors about the Hartwell family. Old-timers remembered Elena's grandmother, Magdalena, who had been run out of town decades earlier for practicing what they called dark arts. When Elena began showing the same peculiar behaviors, talking to ravens, knowing when storms were coming days in advance, and somehow always finding water during dry spells, the connection seemed obvious to the superstitious townspeople. Mrs. Dorothy Chambers ran the orphanage with an iron fist and a deep-seated fear of anything she couldn't understand. Elena's strange abilities made her nervous, but as long as the girl kept to herself and caused no trouble, Mrs. Chambers was content to ignore her oddities. That changed when the drought began affecting the entire valley. Crops withered under the relentless sun. Wells that had never run dry began producing nothing but dust. Cattle grew thin and desperate, and tempers in town grew shorter with each passing day. The pastor, Reverend Marcus Bellwether, began holding special prayer meetings, calling on the community to examine their hearts for sin that might have brought God's wrath upon them. It was during one of these meetings that young Tommy Morrison, the blacksmith's son, stood up and pointed a trembling finger at Elena, who sat quietly in the back row of the small wooden church. "She did this," Tommy declared, his voice cracking with adolescent certainty. "I seen her talking to them ravens every morning, and I heard her grandmother was a witch. The drought started right after she turned 15. That's when they say the devil claims his own." The church fell silent, except for the sound of rustling fabric as every head turned to stare at Elena. She sat perfectly still, her green eyes wide with shock, silver streak catching the lamplight like a beacon of everything that made her different. Reverend Bellwether raised his hand for silence, but the damage was done. Murmurs began spreading through the congregation like wildfire. Mrs. Abigail Morrison, Tommy's mother, stood up next. "My boy speaks the truth," she declared. "That girl ain't natural. Animals follow her around like she's got some kind of hold on them. And she always knows things before they happen. Told Mrs. Henderson her cow was gonna die 2 days before it happened. How's a girl know something like that unless she caused it?" Elena finally found her voice. "I didn't cause anything," she said quietly, but her words were lost in the growing chaos. "I just listen to what the animals tell me. They're scared and hungry too." The admission that she truly did communicate with animals only inflamed the crowd. Further, Reverend Bellwether tried to restore order, but fear had taken hold. Within minutes, the meeting had transformed from a prayer service into an impromptu trial. Samuel Crawford had been in town that evening, picking up supplies before heading back to his ranch in the foothills. At 42, he was a practical man who had little patience for superstition. He'd built his spread from nothing, working 16-hour days to carve a living from the harsh Colorado landscape. He believed in hard work, fair dealing, and letting People be who they were as long as they didn't hurt anyone. When he heard the commotion from the church, Samuel stepped inside to see what was happening. What he witnessed disgusted him. A frightened teenage girl surrounded by adults whose fear had twisted their faces into masks of hatred and judgment. "This is madness," Samuel said, his voice cutting through the noise. "You're talking about a child." But the crowd's blood was up. Mrs. Morrison wheeled on him. "You defending a witch, Crawford? Maybe you're in league with her. Your ranch is the only one that ain't suffering from the drought. Mighty convenient, don't you think?" It was true that Samuel's ranch had fared better than most, but only because he'd had the foresight to dig deeper wells and implement water conservation methods he'd learned during his time in California. He tried to explain this to the crowd, but logic had no place in their current state of mind. The unofficial trial continued for 2 hours. Neighbor after neighbor stood up to testify about Elena's strange behavior. Sarah Jenkins claimed Elena had cursed her chickens because they'd stopped laying eggs the day after Elena walked past her property. Frank Morrison swore he'd seen Elena standing in his cornfield at midnight, arms raised to the moon. Martha Kellaway insisted Elena had given her the evil eye just before her prize pig took sick and died. Each accusation grew more elaborate than the last, and Elena's quiet. Denials only seemed to fuel their certainty. When Reverend Bellwether finally called for calm and suggested they sleep on the matter and reconvene in the morning with cooler heads, several voices shouted at him down. "A witch's power grows stronger." "At night," declared Walter Mackenzie, "the town's self-appointed authority on supernatural matters. We can't let her work her evil while we sleep. The longer we wait, the more harm she'll do." The mob was forming before anyone quite realized what was happening. Someone produced a length of rope. Others began talking about the old ways of dealing with witches, trials by fire and water that were really just elaborate methods of execution. Samuel tried once more to intervene. "This is wrong," he said firmly. "Whatever you think she's done, she's still just a girl. If you have evidence of actual crimes, take it to the sheriff in Denver. But this isn't justice." "The sheriff's 3 days' ride from here," Mackenzie replied. "And justice ain't always about courts and lawyers. Sometimes God's people have to take matters into their own hands." Elena had remained silent through most of the proceedings, but as the talk turned to immediate punishment, she finally stood up. Her young voice rang clear in the stuffy church air. "I never hurt anybody," she said. "I help where I can. I found Mrs. Patterson's lost cat. I told Mr. Graves his well was going to run dry so he could dig a new one. I try to help, not hurt. If you're so sure I'm causing this drought, then kill me and see if your precious rain comes back." The challenge hung in the air like smoke. Several people shifted uncomfortably, perhaps realizing for the first time what they were contemplating. But Mackenzie seized on her words. "You hear that? She admits she's got power over the weather. Probably thinks if we kill her quickly, she won't have time to lift the curse. Well, I got news for you, girl. Witches don't die easy, and their curses die with them slowly." What happened next would be debated in whispers for generations. Mackenzie proposed what he called biblical justice. If Elena was truly a witch, God would deliver her. If she was innocent, divine providence would save her. Either way, the matter would be settled according to heaven's will rather than man's judgment. The method he suggested was ancient and terrible. They would bury Elena alive in a wooden box, deep enough that she couldn't dig out, but shallow enough that God could reach her if he chose to intervene. If she survived 3 days and nights, they would know she was innocent and dig her up. If she died, it would prove her guilt, and the curse would die with her. Samuel's protests grew more urgent. "You're talking about murder," he said. "Cold-blooded. Murder of a child. I won't stand for it." But he was one man against 40, and the mob's mind was made up. When Samuel threatened to ride for the sheriff, 3 men volunteered to make sure he didn't leave town until the matter was settled. The preparations took most of the night. A wooden box was hastily constructed, large enough for Eleanor to lie in, but too small for her to sit up or turn around. Air holes were drilled in the top, tiny openings that would provide just enough oxygen to prolong the ordeal. Elena spent her final hours of freedom in the orphanage basement, guarded by Mrs. Morrison and two other women who watched her with a mixture of fear and fascination. They wouldn't let her sleep, convinced that unconsciousness would allow her to work her alleged magic. Instead, they forced her to sit in a hard wooden chair while they took turns reading Bible verses about the punishment of the wicked. As dawn approached, Eleanor's composure finally cracked. She began to cry, not the hysterical sobs of someone pleading for their life, but the quiet, heartbroken tears of a child who had finally understood that the world could be crueler than she'd ever imagined. The burial site was chosen carefully. Half a mile outside town, in a small clearing surrounded by scrub oak and pine trees. The ground was rocky, but not impossible to dig, and the location was far enough from any homes that sounds wouldn't carry on the wind. A dozen men took turns, with shovels, digging a grave 6 feet deep and just wide enough for the wooden box. The work was slow and difficult in the hard-packed earth, and several times someone suggested they'd gone deep enough. But Mackenzie insisted on the full depth. "Has to be done right," he kept saying. "Can't take chances with something like this." Elena was brought to the site as the sun climbed over the eastern mountains. She walked steadily, flanked by 6 men who seemed more nervous than she was. Her face was pale but composed, and she held her head high despite the rope binding her hands behind her back. When she saw the grave and the wooden box beside it, she stopped walking. "Please," she said quietly. "I never hurt anybody. I swear on my mama's grave, I never hurt anybody." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mackenzie stepped forward. "Last chance to confess, girl. Tell us how to break the curse, and maybe we can work something out." Elena looked him straight in the eye. "I can't break a curse I never cast, but I'll tell you this. When I'm gone and your drought keeps going, you'll know you killed an innocent girl for nothing." The words sent a chill through several of the men, but it was too late to back down now. They'd come too far and committed too much to turn back. Elena was forced to lie down in the box. It was a tight fit. Her shoulders touched both sides, and her feet pressed against the end. The lid was positioned above her, and she got her first glimpse of what her world would look like for the next 3 days. A few tiny holes of light in an ocean of darkness. "Any last words?" Mackenzie asked. Elena was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "I forgive you," she said. "All of you. When you realize what you've done, remember that I forgive you." The lid was nailed shut with 6-inch spikes driven deep into the wood. The sound of hammering echoed off the mountains like gunshots. Then the box was lowered into the grave with ropes, and the long process of filling it in began. Samuel Crawford was forced to watch from 20 feet away, held in place by 3 armed men. He would later say that the sound of dirt hitting the wooden box was the most horrible thing he'd ever heard. Worse than the screams of wounded soldiers during his time in the cavalry. Worse than the cries of animals caught in traps. But Elena didn't scream. Even as the first shovelfuls of earth landed on her makeshift coffin, no sound came from below. The silence was somehow more disturbing than screaming would have been. It took an hour to fill the grave completely. When it was done, the site looked like nothing more than a patch of disturbed earth in a forest clearing. Someone placed a few rocks to mark the spot, and then the crowd began to disperse. Most of the men couldn't meet Samuel's eyes as they walked past him. They knew what they'd done, even if they wouldn't admit it to themselves. A few muttered justifications. Better safe than sorry, had to protect the town, God would sort it out. But their words sounded hollow even to their own ears. Samuel was released with a warning to keep his mouth shut and stay on his ranch until the 3 days were up. If he tried to interfere or bring outside help, he'd join Elena in the ground. As he rode home through the morning sunshine, Samuel's mind was already working on a plan. He knew the approximate location of the burial site, and he had 3 days to figure out how to help Elena without getting himself killed in the process. But first, he had to make sure she was still alive to help. Samuel Crawford didn't sleep that first night. He paced the length of his ranch house kitchen, boots echoing on the wooden floor as he turned the situation over in his mind. Every rational thought told him Elena was already dead, buried alive in a wooden box. She couldn't possibly survive more than a few hours. But something deeper, some instinct honed by years of surviving in an unforgiving country, insisted she might still be fighting. The problem wasn't just getting to her. Samuel knew he could handle Mackenzie and his followers if it came to a fight. He'd faced worse odds during his cavalry days. The real challenge was doing it without getting Elena killed in the process. If the townspeople discovered his rescue attempt before he could complete it, they'd simply fill the grave back in and post guards to make sure she stayed buried. As dawn broke over the mountains, Samuel made his decision. He saddled his horse and rode toward town, but not on the main road. Instead, he took a circuitous route through the high country, approaching Millbrook from the north, where the forest grew thick and offered cover. The burial site lay in a clearing that could be seen from several angles, which meant any rescue attempt would have to wait for nightfall. But Samuel needed to know if Elena was still alive before he risked everything on a hopeless cause. He found a position on a rocky outcrop about 200 yards from the gravesite, concealed behind a stand of pine trees. Through his spyglass, he could see the disturbed earth clearly. More importantly, he could see that he wasn't the only one watching. Thomas Brennan, the town's deputy sheriff, sat on a tree stump near the edge of the clearing, a rifle across his knees. Brennan was a decent man under normal circumstances, but he'd grown up in Millbrook and shared the community's superstitions. He'd probably volunteered for guard duty out of genuine belief that he was protecting the town from supernatural harm. Samuel settled in to wait and watch. The sun climbed higher, turning the July day into a furnace. Brennan shifted uncomfortably on his stump, occasionally standing to stretch his legs or take a drink from his canteen. But his eyes never strayed far. From the grave, around noon, Samuel noticed something that made his heart race. A small puff of dust had risen from the burial site, so slight that anyone not watching carefully might have missed it. It happened again a few minutes later, and Samuel realized what he was seeing. Elena was still alive down there, and she was trying to dig herself out. The wooden box wouldn't give her much room to maneuver, but if she could work loose one of the boards or widen the air holes, she might be able to scrape away enough dirt to create a small air pocket. It wouldn't save her life, but it might buy precious time. Samuel found himself silently cheering each tiny movement of earth. Elena Hartwell was proving to be tougher than anyone had imagined, but her efforts were also dangerous. If Deputy Brennan noticed the disturbances, he might decide to add more dirt to the grave or call for reinforcements. The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. Brennan was eventually joined by Frank Morrison, the blacksmith, who brought food and water for the guard shift. The two men talked quietly, occasionally glancing at the grave with expressions that mixed fear and guilt. As evening approached, Samuel began to worry about the second guard. His plan depended on dealing with a single man quietly, but 2 guards changed everything. He was considering his options when Morrison stood up and gathered his things. "I'll be back before dawn," Morrison told Brennan. "Keep your eyes open. Mackenzie says witches are strongest at night." Brennan nodded grimly. "She ain't made a sound all day. Maybe she's already gone." "Better she is," Morrison replied. "Quicker, for everyone." After Morrison left, Samuel waited another hour for full darkness to fall. The temperature dropped rapidly, as it always did in the mountains, and Brennan built a small fire to keep warm. The flames would ruin his night vision. Exactly what Samuel needed. Moving like a shadow, Samuel circled around behind the guard. He'd learned to move silently during his cavalry years, when the difference between noise and quiet could mean the difference between life and death. Every step was carefully placed, every breath controlled. Brennan never knew what hit him. Samuel's cavalry training included techniques for subduing sentries without killing them, and he used those skills now. A sleeper hold applied correctly would render a man unconscious for hours without permanent harm. Brennan slumped forward, and Samuel caught him before he could fall into the fire. He dragged the unconscious deputy to a safe distance and tied him securely with rope from his saddlebags. Brennan would wake up with a headache and some explaining to do, but he'd be alive. Now came the hard part. Samuel had brought a shovel, but digging quietly was nearly impossible. Every scrap of metal against stone sounded like thunder in the night air. He worked as fast as he dared, pausing frequently to listen for approaching riders. The grave was deeper than he'd expected. After an hour of digging, his shovel still hadn't struck wood. Sweat poured down his face despite the cool mountain air, and his shoulders ached from the repetitive motion. But he kept digging, driven by the knowledge that Elena's life depended on his efforts. Finally, his shovel struck something solid. The wooden box lay 6 feet down, exactly as he'd feared. But when Samuel knelt and pressed his ear to the wood, he heard something that made his heart leap, a faint tapping from inside. "Elena," he whispered, "can you hear me?" The tapping became more urgent, and Samuel heard a muffled voice from below. The words were impossible to make out, but the tone was unmistakable, desperate hope mixed with disbelief. "I'm going to get you out," Samuel said quietly, "but I need you to stay as quiet as possible. There might be more guards coming." The tapping stopped, and Samuel set to work on the box itself. The lid had been nailed down with 6-inch spikes, driven deep into the wood. Removing them without making noise was like trying to perform surgery with a sledgehammer. Samuel used his knife to work around each spike, carving away the wood until he could get a grip on the metal. Then came the delicate process of working each spike loose without letting it fall and clatter against the box. One by one, he extracted the nails and set them carefully aside. When the last spike came free, Samuel hesitated for a moment. Once he opened this box, there would be no going back. He'd be committed to seeing Elena to safety, which meant defying the entire town of Millbrook and probably making himself an outlaw in the process. But the choice had been made the moment he saw. 40 adults conspire to murder a frightened teenage girl. Samuel Crawford had spent his life trying to do right by people, and he wasn't about to stop now. He lifted the lid carefully, and Elena's pale face appeared in the darkness. Her eyes were wide and frightened, but very much alive. She tried to sit up and gasped as cramped muscles protested the movement. "Easy," Samuel whispered. "Take your time. How badly are you hurt?" Elena's voice came out as a croak. "Water," she managed. "Please." Samuel had brought a canteen, and he helped Elena drink slowly. The water seemed to restore some of her strength, and she was able to sit up with his assistance. "I knew someone would come," she whispered. "The ravens told me. They said a good man was watching." Under different circumstances, Samuel might have questioned her claim about communicating with birds, but after what he'd witnessed in the past 24 hours, he was prepared to believe almost anything. "Can you climb out?" he asked. "We need to move quickly." Elena nodded, though Samuel could see the effort it cost her. Her legs were stiff from being confined in the narrow box, and her hands were raw from clawing at the wooden walls. But she was alive and mobile, which was more than he dared hope. Getting Eleanor out of the grave proved to be more challenging than digging it had been. Samuel had to lower a rope and help pull her up while she struggled to find footing on the rough dirt walls. Twice she slipped and nearly fell back into the hole, but determination kept her moving upward. When Eleanor finally stood on solid ground again, she swayed dangerously. Samuel caught her arm and steadied her, feeling how thin she'd become during her ordeal. "We need to go," he said urgently. "Can you ride?" Elena nodded, though Samuel wasn't entirely convinced. She looked ready to collapse at any moment. But they had no choice. Deputy Brennan could wake up at any time, and Morrison would be back before dawn. Samuel had brought a second horse, and he helped Elena mount before climbing onto his own gelding. They rode away from the burial site, at a careful pace, avoiding the main roads and sticking to game trails that would be difficult to follow. The first priority was getting Elena somewhere safe where she could recover her strength. Samuel's ranch was the obvious choice, but it was also the first place the townspeople would look. He needed somewhere more remote, somewhere they could hide until Elena was strong enough to travel long distances. He remembered an old line shack in the high country, built by previous owners of his ranch and abandoned for years. It was a hard day's ride from Millbrook, accessible only by mountain trails that most people didn't know existed. If they could reach it, they'd have time to plan their next move. But Elena was weakening rapidly. The ordeal of being buried alive, combined with the physical exertion of escaping, was taking its toll. She slumped forward in her saddle, and Samuel realized she might not make it to the line shack. "Hold on," he told her. "Just a little farther." Elena lifted her head with visible effort. "I'm trying," she whispered. "But I'm so tired." Samuel made a quick decision. There was a small cave system about an hour's ride ahead, well hidden and defensible. It wouldn't be comfortable, but it would be safe. They could rest there during the day and continue to the line shack after dark. The cave was exactly as Samuel remembered it, a narrow opening behind a screen of brush that opened into a chamber large enough for 2 people. Water seeped from the rock walls, forming a small pool that would provide fresh drinking water. Elena collapsed as soon as they were inside, her strength finally giving out completely. Samuel wrapped her in blankets from his saddlebags and tried to make her as comfortable as possible on the rocky floor. "Thank you," Elena whispered. "I thought I was going to die down there." "You're safe now," Samuel assured her. "But we need to keep moving. Once they discover you're gone, they'll come looking." Elena nodded weakly. "Where will we go?" It was a good question, and Samuel didn't have a complete answer. Millbrook wasn't the only town where superstition ran deep, and word of Elena's alleged witchcraft would spread quickly. They needed to get far away, probably to a large city where strangers were common and old prejudices held less sway. "Denver, maybe," Samuel said, "or Colorado Springs, somewhere you can start over with a new name." Elena was quiet for a long moment. "What about you?" she asked finally. "You can't go back to Millbrook after this. They'll know you helped me." Samuel had been thinking about that too. His ranch represented 20 years of hard work, but it was just property. Elena's life was irreplaceable. "I'll manage," he said. "The important thing is getting you somewhere safe." As dawn approached, they could hear riders in the distance, search parties spreading out from Millbrook to look for the escaped witch. Samuel and Elena huddled deeper in the cave, listening to the sound of horses and shouting men as they passed nearby. The searchers were thorough but not imaginative. They checked the obvious hiding places, abandoned buildings, dense thickets, stream beds, but never thought to look for a concealed cave entrance. After several hours, the sounds faded as the search moved to other areas. Elena slept fitfully through the day, her body trying to recover from the trauma of burial. Samuel kept watch at the cave entrance, his rifle ready in case the searchers returned. But the mountains remained quiet except for the normal sounds of wildlife. As evening approached, Samuel began preparing for the next leg of their journey. The line shack was still their best option for a safe haven, But getting there would require traveling through a country where search parties might be active. Elena woke as Samuel was checking his supplies. She looked better after a day of rest, though still pale and weak. "How far is this cabin?" she asked. "About 6 hours by mountain trails," Samuel replied. "But we'll be traveling at night, so it might take longer." Elena struggled to her feet, testing her strength. "I can make it," she said with more confidence than she probably felt. Samuel hoped she was right. They were running out of safe places to hide, and winter was still months away. Whatever happened next, they would need to be far from Colorado territory before the first snow made travel impossible. The sun was setting behind the western peaks as they emerged from the cave and prepared to continue their flight from the madness that had consumed Millbrook. The mountain trail to the line shack proved treacherous in the darkness. What Samuel remembered as a manageable path had been washed out in several places by spring runoff, forcing them to dismount and lead their horses around dangerous gaps. Elena's strength held better than he'd expected, but he could see the strain in her movements as they climbed higher into the thin air. 3 hours into their journey, they encountered their first real obstacle. The trail rounded a steep cliff face where a rockslide had completely blocked the passage. In daylight, they might have found a way around it, but attempting to navigate the unstable slope in darkness would be suicide. "We'll have to go back and take the northern route," Samuel said, studying the barrier by moonlight. Elena slumped against a boulder, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "How much farther is that?" "Adds about 4 hours to the trip," Samuel admitted, "but it's the only safe way." They had already been traveling for half the night, and Eleanor was clearly reaching her limits. Samuel made the difficult decision to find shelter and wait for daylight, despite the risk of being discovered by search parties. He remembered a shepherd's shelter about an hour back down the trail, a crude stone hut built into the mountainside that provided basic protection from the elements. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. The shelter was exactly as Samuel remembered, a single room with a dirt floor and a fireplace that had seen better days. Someone had used it recently. There were signs of a camp, including a small store of firewood and some basic supplies. "We can't risk a fire," Samuel said as they settled in, "but we should be safe here until morning." Elena wrapped herself in blankets and leaned against the stone wall. "Tell me about this line shack," she said. "How long can we stay there?" Samuel had been wondering the same thing. The cabin would provide temporary refuge, but it wasn't a permanent solution. "Maybe a week or two," he said. "Long enough for you to regain your strength and for us to plan the next move." And then the question hung between them like smoke. Samuel had been avoiding thinking too far ahead, focusing on immediate survival rather than long-term consequences. But Elena deserved an honest answer. "Denver, most likely," he said. "It's big enough that you could disappear into the crowd, find work maybe, start a new life under a different name." Elena was quiet for several minutes. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "What if they're right about me?" Samuel turned to look at her in the dim moonlight, filtering through the shelter's single window. "What do you mean?" "The things I can do," Elena said. "Talking to animals, knowing when storms are coming, finding water where others can't. What if there really is something unnatural about me?" It was a question Samuel had been avoiding since the rescue. He'd witnessed Elena's unusual abilities firsthand, and he couldn't explain them any more than the townspeople could. The difference was that he didn't automatically assume supernatural meant evil. "Even if there is," Samuel said carefully, "that doesn't make you a witch, and it sure doesn't justify what they tried to do to you." Elena pulled the blankets tighter around herself. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about our family. She said we had gifts that went back generations, women who could heal with herbs, who understood the language of wild things, who knew secrets that other people feared." "Sounds like useful skills in a country like this," Samuel observed. That's what I always thought, Elena agreed. But maybe the townspeople were right to be afraid. Maybe there are some gifts that are too dangerous to have. Samuel moved closer to where Eleanor sat. Listen to me, he said firmly. I've seen evil in this world, real evil, done by ordinary people who chose to hurt others for their own gain. What happened to you in Millbrook wasn't about supernatural powers or ancient curses. It was about fear making good people do terrible things. Elena looked up at him with those unsettling green eyes. Then why do I feel like I brought this on? Myself? Like maybe if I'd been more careful to hide what I could do, none of this would have happened. The question revealed the deeper wound that Elena carried. Not just the physical trauma of being buried alive, but the psychological damage of being rejected by an entire community. Samuel recognized the signs from his own experiences during the war, when soldiers blamed themselves for surviving battles that claimed their friends. That's not how blame works, Samuel said. You didn't choose to be born with unusual abilities, any more than you chose to be an orphan. The only choice you made was trying to help people with the gifts you were given. There's no shame in that. They dozed fitfully through the remaining hours of darkness, taking turns keeping watch. Samuel had expected search parties to continue through the night, but the mountains remained quiet. Either the townspeople had given up the immediate pursuit, or they were concentrating their efforts in other areas. Dawn brought clear skies and the kind of crisp mountain air that made everything seem possible. Elena looked stronger after a few hours of rest, and her natural resilience was beginning to reassert itself. The northern trail starts about half a mile east of here, Samuel said as they prepared to leave the shelter. It's longer but safer, and fewer places where we could be spotted from a distance. The northern route proved to be everything Samuel had promised, and more. The trail wound through dense forest and across high meadows that offered spectacular views of the surrounding peaks. Under different circumstances, it would have been a pleasant ride. But the constant need to watch for pursuit kept them both tense and alert. They encountered their first real scare around midday. The trail emerged from a grove of aspen trees into an open meadow, and Samuel immediately spotted riders on a distant ridge, too far away to identify, but close enough to be dangerous if they decided to investigate the meadow. Samuel and Elena quickly retreated into the trees and waited. The riders, 3 men on horseback, seemed to be scanning the landscape. Systematically, after several minutes, they moved on, but the encounter served as a reminder of how precarious their situation remained. How many men do you think Mackenzie has out looking? Eleanor asked as they resumed their journey. Most of the able-bodied men in town, Samuel replied. Maybe 20 or 30 riders spread across a lot of territory. The good news is that it gives us better odds of avoiding them. The afternoon brought a new challenge. Storm clouds began building over the western peaks, promising the kind of sudden mountain thunderstorm that could turn trials into torrents and make travel impossible. They needed to reach the line shack before the weather broke. Samuel pushed the pace as much as he dared, but Elena's horse was showing signs of fatigue. The animal had been chosen for availability rather than stamina, and the demanding mountain terrain was taking its toll. We might have to double up, Samuel said, eyeing the approaching storm clouds. Your horse won't make it much farther. Elena patted her mount's neck sympathetically. She's done her best. How far to the cabin? About 2 hours if we keep this pace, Samuel estimated. Maybe 3 if we have to ride double. The decision was made for them when Elena's horse stumbled on a loose rock and came up lame. The injury wasn't serious, but the animal couldn't carry a rider over rough terrain. They would have to abandon it and hope Samuel's gelding could carry them both to safety. Transferring their supplies to the remaining horse and getting Elena mounted behind Samuel took precious time. The storm clouds were building rapidly, and Samuel could smell rain in the air. Mountain storms moved fast and hit hard. They might have 30 minutes before the trail became impassable. Samuel's horse was strong and sure-footed, but carrying double was a different challenge. The gelding had to pick its way more carefully. Across rocky sections and steep climbs left the animal breathing hard in the thin air. The first drops of rain began falling as they crested a ridge and caught sight of their destination. The line shack sat in a small clearing, surrounded by tall pines, exactly as Samuel remembered it. Smoke rose from the chimney, which brought him up short. "Someone's there?" Elena said quietly. Samuel studied the cabin through his spyglass. A single horse stood in a makeshift corral beside the building, and the door hung open to reveal a figure moving around inside. Too far away to identify, but clearly not one of the search parties from Millbrook. Probably just a trapper or prospector using the place for shelter, Samuel said. Most people who travel these mountains know about the cabin. The question was whether to approach or find another shelter. The storm was intensifying rapidly, and they didn't have many options. Samuel made the decision to investigate, keeping his rifle ready in case the occupant proved hostile. They rode slowly into the clearing, making enough noise to announce their presence without seeming threatening. The figure in the cabin emerged onto the small porch, an elderly man with a white beard and clothes that had seen better days. "Afternoon," the stranger called out. "Looks like you folks caught some weather." Samuel relaxed slightly. The man's voice and manner suggested a harmless traveler rather than a threat. "Afternoon," Samuel replied. "Mind if we shelter here until the storm passes?" "Course not," the old man said. "Name's Jacob Westman. Been using this place on and off for years. Come on in before you get soaked." Thunder rolled across the mountains as they dismounted and led Samuel's horse to the makeshift corral. The first real downpour began just as they reached the cabin's porch, confirming Samuel's decision to seek shelter. Jacob Westman turned out to be a retired prospector who spent his summers in the high country looking for mineral deposits. He'd been using the line shack as a base camp for the past 2 weeks, completely unaware of the drama unfolding in Millbrook. "Haven't seen another soul in days," Jacob said, as they settled around the cabin's small table. "Course, that's how I like it. Too many people in the valleys these days." Elena remained quiet, letting Samuel handle the conversation. They'd agreed on a cover story. She was Samuel's niece, and they were traveling to Denver to visit relatives. Simple and believable, as long as no one looked too closely. The storm raged for 3 hours, turning the clearing into a muddy bog and making travel impossible. Samuel used the time to rest and plan their next moves, while Elena seemed to draw strength from being in a safe, warm place for the first time in days. Jacob proved to be an excellent cook, producing a meal of venison stew and fresh bread that seemed like a feast after their meager trail rations. He was also a natural storyteller, regaling them with tales of his prospecting adventures and the characters he'd encountered in the mountains. "Found a silver vein up near Copper Creek last month," Jacob said as they finished eating. "Not enough to make me rich, but enough to keep me in supplies for another season." Samuel listened with genuine interest, but part of his attention remained focused on Elena. She seemed to be recovering well from her ordeal, but he could see the toll that constant vigilance was taking. She jumped at every unexpected sound and rarely let her guard down completely. As evening approached and the storm finally began to clear, Jacob made an unexpected offer. "You folks are welcome to stay the night," he said. "Trail's going to be treacherous after all this rain, and there's plenty of room." Samuel was tempted. Elena needed more rest, and traveling muddy mountain trails in darkness would be dangerous. But staying meant risking discovery if search parties expanded their efforts to the high country. Before Samuel could respond, Elena spoke up for the first time since entering the cabin. "That's very kind," she said, "but we should probably keep moving. We're expected in Denver, and people will worry if we're too late." Jacob nodded understandingly. "Course. Family comes first. But if you change your mind, the offer stands. As they prepared to leave, Jacob pulled Samuel aside. "Your niece seems like a good girl," he said quietly, "but she's got the look of someone who's seen more trouble than she should have at her age. Are you taking good care of her?" Samuel met the old man's eyes steadily. "Best I can," he said. "Sometimes that's all a man can do." Jacob nodded approvingly. "Sometimes that's enough." They rode out of the clearing as the last light faded from the western sky, leaving Jacob Westman to his solitary vigil in the mountains. The trail was muddy but passable, and Samuel's horse seemed refreshed after the rest and feed. For the first time since the rescue, Samuel began to feel cautiously optimistic. They'd put considerable distance between themselves and Millbrook, found temporary shelter, and avoided the search parties. Elena was growing stronger, and they had enough supplies to reach Denver or another large town where she could disappear. But their luck was about to run out in a way that neither of them could have anticipated. The ambush came at dawn, 3 days after they'd left Jacob Westman's company. Samuel and Elena had been making good time on the descent toward the foothills, following a seldom-used miner's track that would eventually connect with the main road to Denver. They'd grown comfortable with their routine, traveling during daylight hours when the terrain was visible, camping in hidden spots away from any established trails, and maintaining the vigilance that had kept them safe thus far. That comfort nearly got them killed. The attack came from a cluster of boulders overlooking a narrow section of trail. Samuel's horse stumbled on loose shale, and as he leaned forward to steady the animal, a rifle shot cracked across the canyon. The bullet passed close enough to part his hair. "Down!" Samuel shouted, throwing himself from the saddle and pulling Elena with him behind their horse. The gelding, trained during Samuel's cavalry days, stood steady despite the gunfire, a trait that probably saved their lives. More shots rang out from multiple positions, confirming Samuel's worst fear. This wasn't a chance encounter with bandits, or a single determined pursuer. Someone had organized a proper manhunt, with enough men to set up coordinated ambushes. "Can you see them?" Elena whispered, pressed flat against the rocky ground. Samuel risked a quick look around their horses' legs. Muzzled flashes revealed at least 4 different shooting positions among the rocks above the trail. Professional work by men who knew how to hunt human prey. "Too many," Samuel replied grimly, "and they've got the high ground." The situation was tactically hopeless. Samuel's single rifle against multiple shooters in fortified positions was no contest. Their only advantage was that the attackers seemed more interested in pinning them down than killing them outright, probably hoping to take Elena alive for some kind of public trial, but that advantage wouldn't last long. Eventually the shooters would work up the courage for a direct assault, and then it would be over. Elena clutched Samuel's arm. "There's something I haven't told you," she said, urgently. "About my abilities." Samuel kept his eyes on the rocks above them. "Now's not the time for confessions." "It is if it can get us out of this," Elena insisted. "I can do more than talk to animals. Sometimes I can influence them." Before Samuel could ask what she meant, Elena closed her eyes and began making a sound he'd never heard before, a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to vibrate in his bones. The noise was barely audible over the sporadic gunfire, but something about it made the hair on Samuel's neck stand up. At first, nothing happened. Then Samuel began to notice movement in the rocks above them, not human movement, but something else. Dark shapes flitted between the boulders, and the sound of angry chittering began to echo off the canyon walls. The shooting slowed, then stopped entirely as confused shouts replaced the crack of rifles. Samuel risked a longer look and saw something that defied belief. Hundreds of bats were swarming among the rocks where the shooters were hidden, diving and wheeling in a coordinated attack that sent the ambushers scrambling for cover. "How?" Samuel breathed. Elena's eyes remained closed, her strange humming continuing. "There's a cave system in those rocks," she said without breaking her concentration. full of bats trying to sleep. I asked them to help us. The chaos above intensified as more bats joined the swarm. The creatures weren't actually harming the men, but their presence made aiming impossible and turned hardened gunmen into panicked targets, stumbling over rocks in their haste to escape. "Now," Elena said, opening her eyes, "we go now while they're distracted." Samuel didn't waste time with questions. He helped Elena mount their horse and climbed up behind her, spurring the gelding into a gallop down the narrow trail. Behind them, the sound of cursing and flailing continued as the bat swarm maintained its assault. They rode hard for 2 hours before Samuel felt safe enough to slow their pace. The trail had descended into thicker forest, where pursuit would be more difficult, and they'd put several miles between themselves and the ambush site. "That was impossible," Samuel said when they finally stopped to rest. "What you did back there, I've never seen anything like it." Eleanor slumped forward in the saddle, clearly exhausted by whatever she'd done. "My grandmother taught me when I was little," she said weakly. "She said it was a gift that ran in our family, the ability to speak with creatures of the night and shadow. I'd never tried it with so many animals at once." Samuel helped Elena down from the horse and found a fallen log where she could sit. Her face was pale, and her hands trembled slightly. The effort had clearly taken a toll. "How did they find us?" Elena asked. "We were so careful." Samuel had been wondering the same thing. The ambush had been too well organized to be a lucky guess. Someone had known their route and had time to position men accordingly. "Maybe they didn't find us," Samuel said slowly. "Maybe they were waiting for us." Elena looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Think about it," Samuel continued, pieces falling into place. "There are only so many ways to get from the high country to Denver. If you had enough men and knew the territory, you could watch all the major routes." It was a sobering realization. They'd been thinking of their escape as a game, of hide and seek, but their pursuers were playing a much more sophisticated game. Walter Mackenzie had obviously enlisted help from outside Millbrook, men with military or law enforcement experience who knew how to organize a proper manhunt. "So what do we do now?" Eleanor asked. Samuel studied their surroundings while he considered options. They were still 2 days from Denver by the direct route, but that path was obviously compromised. Going around would add time they might not have, especially if other ambush sites were waiting. "We change the rules," Samuel decided. "Stop running and start hunting." Elena looked at him with confusion. "Hunting what?" "Information," Samuel explained. "We need to know how many men are after us and how they're organized. Right now we're blind, reacting to their moves instead of making our own." The plan that formed in Samuel's mind was dangerous but necessary. Instead of continuing their flight toward Denver, they would circle back and observe their pursuers, learn their patterns, identify their weaknesses, and find a way to turn the tables. But first, Elena needed time to recover from her supernatural exertions. They found a defensible position in a grove of cottonwood trees near a small stream and settled in to wait for nightfall. As Elena rested, Samuel took inventory of their situation. They had enough food for perhaps 3 days, sufficient ammunition for a brief firefight, and 1 tired horse carrying double. Not exactly the resources for a prolonged campaign against superior numbers, but they also had advantages their enemies couldn't match. Elena's unusual abilities had already proven decisive once, and Samuel's military training gave him skills that frontier townspeople lacked. Most importantly, they were fighting for Elena's life, while their pursuers were motivated by fear and superstition, emotions that could be turned against them. As evening approached, Samuel outlined his plan. "We go back toward the ambush site after dark," he said. "Not to the exact spot, but close enough to watch what they do next. If they're smart, they'll post guards at key points and wait for us to make another run at Denver. And if they're not smart," Elena asked, "then they'll chase us blindly and make mistakes we can exploit," Samuel replied. "Either way, we learn something useful." Elena nodded slowly. What if they have more men with those same night-hunting abilities you mentioned? It was a valid concern. If Mackenzie had recruited professional manhunters, they might have tracking skills that would make concealment impossible. But Samuel had dealt with military trackers during the war, and he'd learned that even the best could be fooled with the right techniques. We'll find out, Samuel said simply. But staying ahead of them indefinitely isn't an option. Eventually we'll make a mistake or run out of luck. Better to take control of the situation while we still can. They waited until full darkness before beginning their careful approach to the ambush site. Samuel left their horse tied in a concealed spot about a mile away. They would be moving on foot from here, and the animal would only slow them down. Chakash. Night was moonless, which aided concealment but made navigation treacherous. Samuel led the way, using techniques learned during night raids in hostile territory, feeling for each footstep and pausing frequently to listen for sounds of human activity. It took 2 hours to reach a position where they could observe the ambush site. What Samuel saw through his spyglass confirmed his suspicions about the caliber of their opposition. 3 campfires were visible among the rocks, positioned to provide security without revealing exact numbers. Sentries had been posted at regular intervals, and Samuel could see the systematic way they rotated guard shifts. This wasn't a mob of angry townspeople. It was a military-style operation run by men who understood their business. Professional bounty hunters, Samuel whispered to Eleanor. Mackenzie must have put up serious money to bring in this kind of talent. Eleanor studied the distant fires. How many do you think? Samuel counted carefully, timing the guard changes and estimating based on the number of active positions. 15 to 20 men, he concluded. Maybe more if they have reserves we can't see. The odds were daunting, but not impossible. Samuel had faced worse during the war, and Elena's supernatural abilities provided options that conventional tactics couldn't account for. What's the plan? Elena asked. Samuel continued watching the enemy camp while he formulated their next move. The bounty hunters were clearly settling in for an extended stay, confident that their quarry would eventually have to come through this area to reach civilization. We make them think we're somewhere else, Samuel said. Create a distraction that draws some of them away, then slip through the gap. It was a basic deception, but it could work if executed properly. The question was how to create a convincing diversion without exposing themselves to unnecessary risk. Elena provided the answer. I could call the bats again, she offered. Make them attack one of the other camps while we move past this one. Samuel considered the suggestion. Elena's demonstration that afternoon had been impressive, but it had also exhausted her. Could she repeat the performance without collapsing? How much does it take out of you? Samuel asked. Elena was quiet for a moment. A lot, she admitted. But I'm stronger now than I was this afternoon. And if it gets us past them, the risk was worth taking. Samuel began studying the terrain, looking for the best route through the hunter's perimeter, while Elena rested and prepared for another supernatural effort. As they waited for the optimal moment, Samuel found himself thinking about the larger implications of their situation. Even if they escaped this immediate trap, word of Elena's abilities would spread. The story of the witch who commanded bats would become legend, and that legend would follow her wherever she went. Perhaps it was time to stop running and start fighting back in a different way. If Elena was going to be hunted for the rest of her life, maybe she needed to become someone too dangerous to hunt, but that was a decision for another time. Right now, their focus had to be on survival and escape. Everything else could wait until they reached safety, if they ever did. The betrayal came from an unexpected source. Samuel and Elena had been traveling for 2 hours after leaving Jacob Westman's cabin when they spotted the campfire. It flickered, Through the trees about half a mile ahead, positioned directly on the trail they needed to follow. In the darkness, there was no way to determine who had made the camp or whether it posed a threat. "Could be more travelers like Jacob," Elena whispered as they dismounted and crept closer on foot. Samuel wasn't so optimistic. The fire's location seemed too convenient, too perfectly placed to intercept anyone using this particular route. He motioned for Elena to stay back while he scouted ahead through the underbrush. What he discovered made his blood run cold. 3 men sat around the fire, and Samuel recognized 2 of them immediately: Deputy Brennan, who should have been nursing a headache back in Millbrook, and Frank Morrison, the blacksmith who had helped guard Elena's grave. The third man was a stranger, but his weathered face and careful manner suggested someone familiar with tracking and hunting. "Crawford's got to bring her through here eventually," Morrison was saying as Samuel crept closer. "This trail's the only way to reach Denver without going back through the valley, assuming they're heading for Denver," Brennan replied. "Could be making for Colorado Springs, or even trying to get to the railroad at Pueblo." The stranger, who appeared to be leading the group, shook his head. "A man like Crawford thinks like a soldier. He'll want to get the girl to a big city where she can disappear. Denver's the closest and most direct route." Samuel's heart sank as he realized the implications. These weren't random searchers stumbling around the mountains. They were a focused hunting party with a specific plan. Worse, they clearly understood his thinking well enough to predict his moves. He retreated carefully to where Elena waited, his mind racing through their limited options. The trail ahead was blocked, and backtracking would cost precious time they didn't have. Other search parties were probably covering alternate routes, making this feel increasingly like a carefully orchestrated trap. "What did you see?" Elena asked when Samuel returned. He explained the situation in whispers, watching Elena's face grow pale in the moonlight. She'd been through so much already, and now they were facing the prospect of capture after coming so far. "There might be a way around them," Samuel said, though he didn't sound convinced. "The terrain's rough, but if we can circle north through the timber, we might be able to rejoin the trail on the other side." Eleanor nodded, but Samuel could see the doubt in her eyes. They both knew that navigating unfamiliar mountain terrain in darkness was extremely dangerous. One wrong step could send them tumbling down a cliff face or into a hidden ravine. They spent an hour working their way through dense forest, leading Samuel's horse over fallen logs and around massive boulders. The route was punishing for both humans and animal, and their progress was painfully slow. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot in the quiet mountain air. The breakthrough came when Elena suddenly stopped and tilted her head, listening to something Samuel couldn't hear. "Horses," she whispered, "coming from behind us." Samuel strained his ears, but heard nothing except wind in the trees. Yet he'd learned to trust Elena's unusual perceptions. If she said horses were approaching, they probably were. How many? He asked. Elena closed her eyes, concentrating. 4, maybe 5, still a ways back but moving fast. The hunters had split up, Samuel realized. While 3 men waited on the main trail, others were following their tracks through the forest. The trap was more sophisticated than he'd given them credit for. "We need to move faster," Samuel said. But even as he spoke, he knew it was hopeless. They couldn't outrun mounted pursuers while traveling on foot through difficult terrain. Elena seemed to reach the same conclusion. "There's another way," she said quietly. "What do you mean?" Elena hesitated, clearly reluctant to elaborate. "Something my grandmother taught me, but you might not believe it works." Samuel had seen enough of Elena's abilities to keep an open mind. "Try me." "Animals respond to me," Elena said. "Not just domestic ones. Wild creatures too. If I ask them for help, sometimes they listen." Under normal circumstances, Samuel might have dismissed such a claim as desperate, wishful thinking. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Elena, had already demonstrated abilities that defied easy explanation. "What kind of help?" he asked. Elena looked around the dark forest, then cupped her hands around her mouth and made a sound that was barely audible, a low, trilling call that seemed to blend with the natural night sounds. She repeated it several times, then stood, perfectly still, waiting. Samuel was about to suggest they keep moving when he heard an answering call from somewhere ahead. Then another and another, until the forest seemed alive with soft hooting sounds. "Owls," Elena explained. "They're the best night sentries in the mountains. I asked them to watch for the men following us and to create distractions if possible." The idea seemed far-fetched, but within minutes Samuel began hearing shouts and confusion from behind them. Horses whinnied nervously, and someone cursed loudly, as his mount apparently shied at something in the darkness. "Works better than I expected," Elena said with a faint smile. "The horses don't like sudden owl attacks, especially when they can't see what's happening. They use the confusion to put more distance between themselves and their pursuers, but Samuel knew the respite was temporary. Professional trackers wouldn't be deterred for long by spooked horses and aggressive owls." The landscape began to change. As they climbed higher, the dense forest giving way to more open terrain, dotted with rock formations and scattered stands of trees. It offered better views but less concealment, forcing them to move more carefully to avoid being spotted. Elena called another halt as they created a small ridge. "Something's wrong," she said, studying the valley spread out below them. Samuel followed her gaze, but saw nothing unusual, just moonlit meadows and dark patches of forest. "What is it?" "Too quiet," Elena replied. "No night sounds at all. Something has the animals spooked." As if to prove her point, a lone coyote began, howling from a distant ridge, quickly joined by others, until the mountains echoed with their mournful calls. But instead of the usual territorial chorus, these sounds carried a note of alarm that raised the hair on Samuel's neck. "They're warning each other," Elena said. "There are men moving through their territory. More men than should be out here." The realization hit Samuel like a physical blow. This wasn't just a search party or even multiple search parties. Judging by the animals' reaction, there were dozens of men positioned throughout the mountains, creating a net that was steadily tightening around them. "Mackenzie's brought in help," Samuel said grimly. "Probably hired professional manhunters from Denver or Colorado Springs." Eleanor's face went white. "How many?" "Enough to cover every trail between here and civilization," Samuel replied. "They're not just trying to recapture you. They want to make sure you never reach anywhere you could tell your story." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Mackenzie had somehow convinced other communities that Elena represented a genuine supernatural threat, rallying enough support to fund a major manhunt. Or perhaps word of her alleged witchcraft had spread naturally, creating the kind of hysteria that could drive normally rational people to extreme measures. "We can't outrun them," Elena said, stating the obvious. Samuel nodded grimly. "But we might be able to outlast them. These hired guns won't want to spend weeks combing the mountains. For one girl, if we can find a really good hiding place and wait for them out." "Where?" Elena asked. "Any place we could hide they can find." Samuel was quiet for several minutes, thinking through their options. Then he remembered something from his cavalry days, a technique for evading pursuit that relied on doing the unexpected. "What if we don't hide?" he said slowly. "What if we go on the offensive instead?" Elena looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. "Against dozens of armed men?" "Not directly," Samuel explained. "But what if we could turn their numbers against them, create enough confusion and misdirection that they end up chasing shadows while we slip away?" The plan that formed in Samuel's mind was risky and complicated, requiring perfect timing and More than a little luck, but it might be their only chance of escaping the tightening net. It would mean splitting up, Samuel warned, at least temporarily, and it would put you in considerable danger. Elena considered this soberly. More danger than I'm already in? Different kind of danger, Samuel admitted. Instead of running and hiding, you'd be actively trying to mislead armed men who want you dead. Tell me the plan, Elena said. Samuel outlined his idea, watching Elena's expression change from skepticism to cautious interest. The strategy relied heavily on her unique abilities, her communication with animals, her knowledge of wilderness survival, and her small size that would allow her to move through terrain that would challenge larger pursuers. The key is creating multiple false trails, Samuel explained. If we can convince them that you're moving in several different directions at once, they'll have to split their forces to cover all the possibilities. Elena nodded slowly. And while they're chasing false leads, I circle back and head for Denver, on a route they've already searched. Exactly. But it means you'll be traveling alone through a country you don't know, with no backup if something goes wrong. Elena was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risks. What about you? She asked finally. What happens to you in this plan? Samuel had been dreading that question. His role in the deception would require him to act as a highly visible decoy, drawing attention away from Elena's actual escape route. It was a job that would almost certainly end with his capture or death. "I'll manage," he said, not meeting her eyes. Elena wasn't fooled. "You'll sacrifice yourself so I can get away." "I'll do whatever it takes to get you to safety," Samuel replied, firmly. "That's what this has been about from the beginning." Elena studied his face in the moonlight, seeing the determination there. "There has to be another way." "Maybe," Samuel conceded, "but I can't think of one, and we're running out of time." As if to emphasize his point, they heard the distant sound of a hunting horn echoing across the mountains. It was answered by another horn from a different direction, then another, creating an eerie symphony that spoke of coordinated effort and professional organization. "They're closing in," Samuel said. "We need to make a decision." Elena closed her eyes, and Samuel could almost see her weighing their options. When she opened them again, her expression was resolute. "All right," she said, "but I have one condition." "What's that?" "If your part of the plan goes wrong, if you get captured or killed, I don't keep running. I come back and tell the world what really happened in Millbrook." Samuel wanted to argue, to insist that her safety was more important than justice or revenge, but he could see that Elena needed this promise, needed to know that his sacrifice would serve a larger purpose than just her individual survival. "Agreed," he said, "but only if there's no other choice." Elena nodded, then surprised him by reaching out and squeezing his hand. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Samuel squeezed back, trying to memorize the moment. In a few hours, they would part ways, and there was a good chance they would never see each other again. But for now, they were still together, still fighting against the forces that had tried to destroy an innocent girl for the crime of being different. The hunting horns sounded again, closer this time. Their brief respite was over, and the final phase of their desperate flight was about to begin. The separation happened at dawn, in a small clearing where 3 mountain trails converged. Samuel had spent the remaining hours of darkness preparing for what might be his final act of deception, while Elena gathered supplies and steeled herself for traveling alone through hostile territory. They had created an elaborate system of false trails during the night, using techniques Samuel remembered from his cavalry days. Broken branches here, disturbed earth there, even pieces of Elena's clothing strategically placed to suggest she had passed through areas where she had never been. The goal was to create enough confusion that the manhunters would waste precious time following dead ends. Remember, Samuel said as they made their final preparations. "Stay off the main trails completely. Use game paths and stream beds whenever possible, and trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is." Elena nodded, though Samuel could see the fear in her eyes. She was trying to be brave, but the prospect of navigating unknown wilderness alone would have terrified anyone, let alone a 15-year-old girl who had never traveled far from Millbrook. "The trading post at Copper Falls is your first landmark," Samuel continued. "Old Norwegian fellow named Sven runs it, been there for 20 years and minds his own business. If anyone asks, you're traveling to visit relatives in Golden. And if I can't find the trading post, follow Willow Creek downstream. It runs right past the place, and Sven always keeps a lamp burning at night. You can't miss it." Eleanor shouldered her pack, testing the weight. Samuel had given her most of their remaining supplies, keeping only what he needed for his own desperate mission. She looked small and vulnerable, loaded down with gear, but there was steel in her spine that reminded Samuel of soldiers he'd known who had faced impossible odds with quiet courage. "What if your plan doesn't work?" Elena asked. "What if they capture you right away?" Samuel had been wondering the same thing. His strategy depended on staying free long enough to lead the manhunters on a lengthy chase through the mountains, buying Elena time to reach safety. If he was caught immediately, the whole plan would collapse. "Then you keep moving and don't look back," Samuel said firmly. "Promise me that, no matter what happens." Elena met his eyes steadily. "I promise. But I also promise that if you don't make it out of this, the whole world is going to know what Walter Mackenzie and his people did. I won't let them bury the truth the way they tried to bury me." The determination in her voice reminded Samuel why he was willing to risk everything for this girl. Elena Hartwell had been tested in ways that would have broken many adults, yet she emerged with her sense of justice intact and her compassion undimmed. They parted ways as the first light of dawn touched the eastern peaks. Elena headed north, toward a barely visible game trail that would take her deep into wilderness country, while Samuel mounted his horse and rode south toward the main trail where he knew manhunters would be waiting. Samuel's plan was simple in concept, but dangerous in execution. He would make himself visible to the search parties, then lead them on a chase that took them as far as possible from Elena's actual route. The key was staying ahead of them long enough to create genuine confusion about Elena's whereabouts while giving her time to reach the trading post at Copper Falls. He didn't have to wait long for contact. Samuel had been riding for less than an hour when he spotted riders emerging from a grove of aspen trees about half a mile ahead. 3 men on horseback, moving with the purposeful efficiency of professional trackers. Samuel let them see him clearly, then wheeled his horse and galloped back the way he had come. Behind him, shouts echoed across the mountainside as the manhunters spurred their mounts in pursuit. The chase began in earnest as Samuel led his pursuers through a maze of interconnected trails, always staying just far enough ahead to remain visible but close enough to keep their interest. His horse was fresh and sure-footed, giving him an advantage over men who had been riding hard for days. But Samuel's real advantage was his knowledge of the terrain. He had spent years exploring these mountains, hunting and prospecting during his off-seasons from ranching. He knew which trails led to dead ends, which stream crossings were treacherous, and where a man could lose his pursuers in maze-like rock formations. The first test came when the trail forked near a rushing stream. Samuel took the eastern fork, which he knew led to a narrow canyon with steep walls and limited escape routes. His pursuers would expect him to avoid such obvious traps, so they might waste time exploring the western option before following his actual route. The gamble paid off. From a concealed position on a ridge above the canyon, Samuel watched 2 of the 3 manhunters take the western trail, while only one followed his tracks eastward. The split gave him breathing room and confirmed that his deception strategy was working. Samuel continued the deadly game of cat and mouse throughout the morning, using every trick he could remember from his military service. He doubled back on his own trail, crossed streams at rocky points where his horse's hooves would leave minimal tracks, and even resorted to riding backward for short stretches to confuse anyone trying to determine his direction of travel. By midday, Samuel estimated he was being pursued by at least 8 different men, probably more. The manhunters were using horns to communicate across the mountainside, creating a coordinated effort to box him in. But their very numbers worked against them. With so many searchers covering overlapping territory, confusion was inevitable. The real test came when Samuel approached the area where he and Elena had originally separated. If the manhunters discovered the signs of their camp, they might realize that Elena had gone a different direction entirely. Samuel needed to draw attention away from that area without making his deception too obvious. He solved the problem by staging an apparent accident near a steep ravine, about 2 miles from the actual separation point. Samuel dismounted and carefully led his horse down a treacherous slope, then created signs of a fall, scattered supplies, a torn piece of clothing, and horse tracks leading toward the bottom of the ravine. Then Samuel and his horse climbed back up a different route, staying on rocky ground that would hide their tracks. Anyone following would assume that Eleanor had fallen into the ravine and would waste considerable time searching the area. The deception worked better than Samuel had dared hope. Within an hour, he could hear manhunters converging on the ravine site, their shouts echoing off the canyon walls as they organized a search of the dangerous terrain below. Samuel used the distraction to put serious distance between himself and his pursuers, riding hard toward the high country where the terrain became increasingly difficult for horses. His plan was to lead the manhunters as far from Elena's route as possible, then lose them in the maze of peaks and valleys that stretched toward the Continental Divide. But as afternoon wore on, Samuel began to realize that his strategy had a fatal flaw. The manhunters weren't just following him blindly, they were herding him toward a specific area where other searchers waited in ambush. The trap became apparent when Samuel crested a ridge and found himself looking down at a large meadow surrounded by forest on 3 sides and a steep cliff on the 4th. Several riders were positioned at the edge of the tree line, clearly waiting for him to descend into the open ground, where escape would be impossible. Samuel reined in his horse and considered his options. He could try to backtrack, but pursuing riders were probably close behind. He could attempt to find another route around the meadow, but that would take time he didn't have. Or he could charge straight through the ambush, relying on speed and surprise to carry him past the waiting manhunters. Before Samuel could decide, the choice was made for him. A rifle shot cracked across the meadow, and his horse stumbled, blood flowing from a wound in its shoulder. The animal was still mobile, but clearly in pain and losing strength rapidly. "Samuel Crawford!" a voice shouted from the tree line. "This is Marshal Jake Donovan, federal deputy out of Denver. You're surrounded, and your horse is done for. Surrender now, and we'll guarantee you a fair trial." Samuel recognized the name. Donovan had a reputation as an honest lawman who took his responsibilities seriously. If he was involved in the manhunt, it meant the conspiracy against Elena had reached federal levels. Someone had convinced the authorities that she represented a genuine threat to public safety. "Where's the girl, Crawford?" Donovan called out. "Make this easy on yourself and tell us where she is." Samuel's response was to spur his wounded horse toward the nearest gap in the ring of manhunters. The animal responded gamely despite its injury, breaking into a gallop that carried them down the slope toward the waiting ambush. Rifle shots erupted from multiple positions as Samuel charged through the meadow. Most of the bullets went wide. The manhunters were trying to capture him alive rather than kill him outright. But Samuel felt one round burn across his left arm and another shatter the horn of his saddle. His horse made it halfway across. The meadow, before its strength finally gave out, the animal stumbled and went down, throwing Samuel clear but leaving him exposed in the middle of the open ground with nowhere to hide. Samuel rolled to his feet and drew his revolver, more out of instinct than any real hope of fighting his way out. He was outnumbered at least 6-1, caught in the open with limited ammunition, but Elena was counting on him to buy her more time, and he wasn't ready to surrender yet. "Last chance, Crawford," Marshal Donovan shouted. "Throw down your weapon, and we'll take you alive." Samuel's answer was a pistol shot that sent the marshal's hat flying. It was more defiant gesture than serious attack, but it accomplished his goal of preventing immediate capture. The manhunters responded with a volley of rifle fire that kicked up dirt all around Samuel's position. He dove behind his fallen horse, using the animal's body as cover while he tried to think of a way out of the trap. The standoff continued for several minutes, with Samuel exchanging occasional shots with his pursuers, while they gradually tightened the circle around his position. He knew it was hopeless. He had maybe a dozen rounds left, and the manhunters could keep him pinned down until nightfall if necessary. But as the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, Samuel realized that his desperate gamble might have succeeded after all. He had led the manhunters miles from Elena's actual route and kept them occupied for an entire day. With any luck, she was already at the trading post at Copper Falls, safe from immediate pursuit. The thought gave Samuel a sense of peace he hadn't expected. Win or lose, he had kept his promise to protect Elena. Whatever happened next, she had a fighting chance to reach safety and tell the world what had really happened in Millbrook. "Time's up, Crawford," Marshal Donovan called out as the light began to fade. "We're coming for you, whether you surrender or not." Samuel could hear the manhunters moving through the tall grass, closing in from multiple directions. In a few minutes, they would be close enough to rush his position, and his small-caliber revolver wouldn't be much use against 6 rifles. He was preparing for a final, futile charge when salvation came from an unexpected source. A low rumbling sound began to build in the distance, growing louder and more ominous with each passing second. Samuel looked up to see a wall of dark clouds rolling over the western peaks, moving with the kind of speed that promised a truly violent mountain storm. Lightning flickered in the cloud mass, and the rumbling resolved into the continuous growl of thunder. The manhunters had noticed the approaching weather too, and Samuel could hear uncertainty in their voices as they discussed whether to continue the assault or seek shelter. Marshal Donovan made the decision for them. "Pull back to the tree line," he shouted. "We'll wait out the storm and finish this when it passes." The retreat gave Samuel the opening he needed. As the first drops of rain began to fall, and the manhunters hurried toward the shelter of the forest, Samuel abandoned his position behind the dead horse and ran toward the cliff face that bordered the meadow. He had noticed earlier that the cliff wasn't as solid as it appeared from a distance. Water erosion had carved numerous cracks and ledges into the rock face, creating a network of handholds that might allow an experienced climber to scale the apparently impossible barrier. Samuel reached the base of the cliff just as the storm broke in earnest. Rain began falling in torrents, and lightning illuminated the meadow in stark, brilliant flashes. The manhunters had taken shelter in the forest, confident that their quarry was trapped in the open ground with nowhere to go. They were wrong. Samuel began climbing the cliff face, using techniques learned during his cavalry service in mountainous terrain. The rock was slippery from the rain, and several times he nearly lost his grip on the narrow ledges. But desperation gave him strength, and the storm provided cover for his escape attempt. It took Samuel nearly an hour to reach the top of the cliff, his hands bloody and his muscles screaming from the effort. But when he finally hauled himself over the rim and onto solid ground, he was free. Behind him, the manhunters continued to wait out the storm, unaware that their quarry had vanished into the darkness above. Samuel allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. then set off into the night toward an uncertain future. Elena was safe, or at least as safe as he could make her. The rest was up to her courage, her wits, and whatever strange gifts had marked her as different from the beginning. Samuel Crawford had kept his promise. Now it remained to be seen whether Elena Hartwell could keep hers. Elena's journey through the wilderness tested every survival skill she possessed, and several she didn't know she had. The game trail Samuel had directed her to proved even more treacherous than expected, winding through dense thickets and across unstable scree slopes that threatened to send her tumbling into hidden ravines. By the second day alone, Elena's supplies were running dangerously low. She had rationed her food carefully, but the physical demands of traveling rough terrain on foot consumed more energy than she had anticipated. Her water situation was even more critical. The streams shown on Samuel's rough map either ran dry or proved impossible to locate in the maze of similar-looking valleys. It was during her search for water that Elena first encountered the hermit. She had been following what appeared to be an animal path down a steep hillside when she spotted smoke rising from a grove of pine trees below. The sight filled her with both hope and terror. Hope because it meant human habitation and possible help. Terror because any stranger might be connected to the manhunt that had driven her into the wilderness. Elena approached the smoke source, cautiously, using skills learned during childhood games of hide-and-seek that had taken on deadly serious importance. Through the trees, she could see a small cabin built into the hillside, so well camouflaged that it seemed to grow naturally from the landscape. An elderly man sat on the cabin's porch, smoking a pipe and watching the forest with the patient attention of someone who had spent decades learning to read the subtle signs of wilderness life. He was small and wiry, with long grey hair and a beard that hadn't seen scissors in years. His clothes were patched and faded but clean, and his weathered hands moved with the careful precision of someone who made everything he owned. Eleanor studied the man for nearly an hour before deciding to reveal herself. Something about his calm demeanor and obvious comfort with solitude suggested he might be trustworthy. More importantly, she was desperate enough for water and shelter that taking the risk seemed preferable to collapsing from exhaustion in the wilderness. She emerged from her hiding place slowly, hands visible and empty of weapons. The old man looked up from his pipe without apparent surprise, as if young women appeared out of the forest every day. "Afternoon," he said calmly. "You look like you could use some water." Elena nodded, suddenly too grateful for words. The man gestured toward a wooden bucket beside his door, then disappeared into the cabin and returned with a tin cup that he filled from a clear spring emerging from the rocks behind his home. The water was cold and pure, the best thing Elena had tasted in days. She drank deeply, then accepted a second cup while the old man studied her with intelligent brown eyes. "Name's Jeremiah Moss," he said finally. "Been living up here for about 15 years now. Don't get many visitors, especially young ladies traveling alone." Elena hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I'm Elena," she said carefully. "I'm traveling to Denver to stay with relatives." Jeremiah nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense, though Elena suspected he wasn't fooled. "Long way to Denver from here, especially for someone traveling the back trails instead of the main roads." Elena's heart sank. If her deception was so transparent to a hermit living in the mountains, how would she convince anyone else? "I can see you're in some kind of trouble," Jeremiah continued gently, "but that's your business, not mine. Question is, do you need help, and are you willing to accept it from someone who asks no questions?" The offer was so unexpected that Elena found herself fighting back tears. After days of constant fear and suspicion, encountering simple human kindness felt almost overwhelming. I don't have any money, Elena said honestly. I can't pay you for help. Jeremiah chuckled. Money's not much use up here anyway. But you look like you could use a meal and a safe place to sleep. That much I can provide, no strings attached. Elena accepted gratefully, and over the next few hours she learned Jeremiah's remarkable story. He had been a teacher in Philadelphia before the war, then served as a field surgeon during some of the conflict's bloodiest battles. The experience had left him with no stomach for civilization's cruelties, so he had headed west in search of solitude and peace. Found both up here, Jeremiah said as they shared a simple meal of venison stew and cornbread. Also found something. I wasn't looking for perspective. Amazing how differently you see the world when you step outside it for a while. Elena found herself opening up to the old hermit in ways she hadn't expected. Perhaps it was his gentle manner, or perhaps it was simply relief at finding someone who didn't automatically assume the worst about her unusual abilities. People fear what they don't understand, Jeremiah observed when Elena finished her carefully edited account of recent events. And fear makes them do terrible things, sometimes to people who deserve nothing but kindness. The conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of hunting horns echoing across the mountains. Elena's blood turned to ice as she recognized the coordinated signals the manhunters used to communicate. "Friends of yours?" Jeremiah asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "The opposite," Elena replied grimly. "They're hunting me." Jeremiah stood and walked to the edge of his porch, listening carefully to the horn calls. His expression grew increasingly grim as he analyzed the sounds. "Professional job," he said, finally. "At least a dozen men, maybe more. They're working a grid pattern, checking every valley, systematically." Elena's heart sank. "How long before they reach here?" "Tomorrow morning, if they maintain their current pace," Jeremiah replied. "But that assumes they don't find your trail first." Elena had been careful to cover her tracks, but she knew that professional trackers could follow signs that would be invisible to ordinary observers. If the manhunters discovered her route to Jeremiah's cabin, both she and the old hermit would be in deadly danger. "I have to leave," Elena said, standing quickly. "I won't bring trouble to someone who's helped me." Jeremiah held up a restraining hand. "Hold on there. Running off into the night won't solve anything. Sit down and let's think this through properly." Elena wanted to argue, but exhaustion and desperation were clouding her judgment. She allowed Jeremiah to guide her back to her seat while he considered their options. "The way I see it," Jeremiah said slowly, "you've got three choices. You can run and hope to stay ahead of them, which probably won't work given their numbers and organization. You can surrender and hope they treat you fairly, which seems unlikely given the effort they're putting into this hunt. Or you can try something unexpected that might throw them off your trail entirely." "What kind of unexpected?" Elena asked. Jeremiah smiled for the first time since hearing the hunting horns. "Well, they're looking for a lone girl fleeing through the wilderness, right? What if that's not what they find?" Over the next hour, Jeremiah outlined a plan that was both simple and audacious. Instead of continuing to run, Elena would hide in plain sight, disguised as someone completely different, and traveling with a companion who could vouch for her identity. "I've got women's clothes left over from my daughter's visits," Jeremiah explained. "She's about your size and age. With the right outfit and a little theatricality, you could pass for a completely different person." Elena was skeptical. "What about you? If they question you?" "I'm a harmless old hermit who lives alone and sees maybe 2 people a year," Jeremiah replied. "They'll ask if I've seen a fugitive girl. I'll say no, and they'll move on to search more promising areas." The plan had merit, but it also required Jeremiah to lie to armed manhunters who might not be gentle with anyone they suspected of helping. Their quarry Elena was reluctant to put the old man at such risk. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked. "You barely know me." Jeremiah was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire he had built to ward off the mountain chill. "Because I've seen what happens when good people stand by and do nothing while innocents suffer," he said finally. "I spent 4 years patching up boys who were torn apart by other boys, all because grown men couldn't find a better way to settle their differences. I swore then that I'd never again stand aside when I could help prevent suffering." Elena felt tears welling up in her eyes. After so many days of being hunted like an animal, Jeremiah's compassion reminded her that not all of humanity had been consumed by fear and hatred. "All right," she said, "what do we need to do?" The transformation began immediately. Jeremiah produced a trunk containing his daughter's belongings, including several dresses that fit Eleanor reasonably well. More importantly, the clothes were of better quality than Elena's simple orphanage garments, suggesting a young woman of higher social standing. "The key is changing not just how you look, but how you carry yourself," Jeremiah explained, as Elena tried on different outfits. "You need to become someone confident, someone who belongs in civilized company rather than hiding in the wilderness." Elena practiced walking and speaking in character, adopting the mannerisms of the wealthy townspeople she had observed during her years in Millbrook. It felt strange to pretend to be someone so different from her actual background, but the deception might save her life. The final touch was an elaborate backstory. Elena would become Margaret Whitman, daughter of a mining engineer from Colorado Springs, traveling to Denver to attend finishing school. Jeremiah would be her guide, hired to escort her safely through the mountains after her original traveling. A party had been delayed by illness. "If they question you closely about mining or engineering, just look confused and say your father never discusses business with ladies," Jeremiah advised. "Rich girls aren't expected to know much about their father's work." They rehearsed the deception until Elena felt comfortable in her new role, then settled in to wait for the manhunter's arrival. Elena spent a restless night in Jeremiah's spare room, alternately hoping the plan would work and fearing that she was about to get a kind old man killed for trying to help her. Dawn brought the sound of approaching horses. Elena, now dressed as Margaret Whitman, sat on the cabin's porch, reading a book while Jeremiah prepared breakfast over his outdoor fire. To any observer, they looked like ordinary travelers taking advantage of a hermit's hospitality. The manhunters appeared as the morning mist began to lift from the valleys below. 6 riders, led by a man Elena recognized with a shock of fear. Walter Mackenzie himself, the architect of her persecution, had joined the hunt personally. Mackenzie rode up to the cabin with the confident air of someone accustomed to having his questions answered promptly. His eyes swept over Elena dismissively before focusing on Jeremiah. "Morning," Mackenzie said curtly. "I'm Walter Mackenzie, representing the territorial authorities. We're tracking a dangerous fugitive through this area, a young woman traveling alone. Have you seen anyone matching that description?" Jeremiah looked up from his cooking with the mild curiosity of someone whose quiet routine had been interrupted. "Fugitive? What did she do?" "Witchcraft and murder," Mackenzie replied grimly. "She's extremely dangerous, especially to anyone who tries to help her." Elena fought to keep her expression neutral while playing the role of a sheltered young woman hearing about such horrors for the first time. She allowed her eyes to widen in apparent shock and moved slightly closer to Jeremiah as if seeking protection. "How frightening," she said in the accent she had practiced. "Father always warned me about the dangers of traveling in remote areas, but I never imagined anything so terrible." Mackenzie's attention focused on Elena for the first time, his eyes taking in her expensive dress and refined manner. "And you are?" "Margaret Whitman," Elena replied smoothly. "Mr. Moss is escorting me to Denver. My father is Theodore Whitman. Perhaps you know him. He owns several mining operations in the Colorado Springs area. Elena held her breath as Mackenzie considered this information. The name Theodore Whitman was one Jeremiah had suggested, belonging to a real mining engineer who was wealthy enough and prominent enough that few people would claim a false connection to him. I know of him, Mackenzie said slowly. How do I? Know you're really his daughter. Elena produced a letter from her pocket, one of several that Jeremiah had prepared using his skills as a former teacher. The handwriting was elegant and the paper expensive, and the contents described a father's concerns for his daughter's safety during her journey to finishing school. Mackenzie examined the letter carefully, clearly looking for signs of forgery, but Jeremiah's work was masterful, and the document appeared entirely genuine. When did you last see this fugitive girl? Mackenzie asked Jeremiah. Haven't seen anyone but Miss Whitman here, Jeremiah replied honestly. Of course, I don't get many visitors anyway. Most folks stick to the main trails when they're traveling. Mackenzie seemed satisfied with the explanation, but Elena could see him studying her face intently, as if trying to determine whether he had seen her somewhere before. She met his gaze with the innocent curiosity of a sheltered young woman encountering rough frontier justice for the first time. This witch, Elena said carefully. What does she look like? We should know what to watch. For shouldn't we? Mackenzie's description of Elena Hartwell was accurate, but focused on her most distinctive features, the green eyes and premature silver streak. Elena had darkened her hair with walnut stain and was wearing a bonnet that shadowed her face, making those identifying characteristics much less obvious. Sounds perfectly dreadful, Elena said with a delicate shudder. I do hope you catch her soon. The thought of such a creature roaming free is quite terrifying. Mackenzie nodded approvingly. We'll have her within a day or two. She can't stay, hidden in these mountains forever. As the manhunters prepared to leave, Elena felt a surge of hope. The deception had worked. Mackenzie himself had failed to recognize the girl he had buried alive just days earlier. But as the riders mounted their horses, one of Mackenzie's men called out an observation that made Eleanor's blood freeze. Boss, the man said, pointing toward the ground near the cabin. These tracks here look pretty fresh, small feet, like a woman's, and they don't match the boots the mining girl is wearing. Mackenzie dismounted and examined the tracks carefully. Elena's heart pounded as she realized that despite all their preparations, they had overlooked the most basic evidence of her presence. Mackenzie knelt beside the tracks, his experienced eyes reading the story they told. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched him trace the outline of her footprints with one finger, noting details that could unravel their entire deception. These prints are less than 12 hours old, Mackenzie said grimly. Small woman, traveling light, moving carefully to avoid detection. He stood and fixed Jeremiah with a hard stare. You said you haven't seen anyone. Jeremiah maintained his calm demeanor, but Elena could see tension in the set of his shoulders. Tracks could be from anyone passing through, hunters, trappers, maybe Indians moving through their old territory. Indian women don't wear boots with heel marks like these, Mackenzie replied. He gestured to one of his men. Tommy, you're our best tracker. What do you make of this? Tommy Morrison, the same young man who had first accused Elena in the church, dismounted and examined the ground with the thoroughness of someone whose survival had often depended on reading the sign correctly. Elena forced herself to remain calm, playing the role of an innocent bystander watching frontier justice unfold. Trail leads right up to this cabin, Tommy said after several minutes of careful study. Then it stops, like whoever made them just vanished. Elena held her breath as Mackenzie's suspicious gaze swept from the tracks to Jeremiah to her. The manhunter's instincts were telling him something wasn't right, but he couldn't quite identify what was bothering him. Miss Whitman, Mackenzie said suddenly, would you mind standing up for a moment? Elena rose gracefully, maintaining the posture and deportment of a well-bred young lady. Mackenzie walked around her slowly, studying her from different angles, with the intensity of a man examining evidence in a criminal case. "Your boots," Mackenzie said finally. "May I see the soles?" It was the moment Eleanor had been dreading. She had changed clothes and altered her appearance, but she was still wearing the same boots that had carried her through days of wilderness travel. If Mackenzie compared them to the tracks, the deception would collapse instantly. "I beg your pardon," Elena said, injecting just the right note of offended dignity into her voice. "Sir, that is hardly an appropriate request to make of a lady." Mackenzie's face flushed slightly. "I apologize for the impropriety, but this is a matter of territorial security. A dangerous criminal is loose in these mountains, and I need to eliminate all possibilities." Jeremiah stepped forward with the protective air of a hired guide defending his employer. "Mr. Mackenzie, Miss Whitman is the daughter of one of Colorado's most prominent citizens. I hardly think it's necessary to subject her to the same treatment you'd give a common suspect." The appeal to class prejudice was calculated perfectly. Mackenzie clearly wanted to pursue his investigation, but antagonizing the daughter of a wealthy mining engineer could have serious consequences for his political ambitions. Elena sensed the manhunter's internal conflict and pressed her advantage. "Perhaps I should mention this incident to Father when I see him," she said, with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to having her complaints taken seriously. "He has considerable influence with the territorial governor." Mackenzie's jaw tightened, but he stepped back. "That won't be necessary, Miss Whitman. I'm simply trying to protect citizens like yourself from a dangerous fugitive." Tommy Morrison, still examining the tracks, called out another observation that made Eleanor's stomach clench. "Boss, there's something else. These prints show wear. A pattern's consistent with someone who's been walking rough terrain for several days, and there are traces of mountain soil that don't match the local geology." Elena fought to keep her expression neutral while her mind raced through possible explanations. The evidence was mounting against their deception, and Mackenzie's suspicions were clearly growing stronger, but salvation came from an unexpected source. One of the manhunters positioned at the edge of the clearing suddenly called out, "Riders! Approaching from the south! Looks like Marshal Donovan's group." Mackenzie's attention immediately shifted to the new arrivals. Elena watched with relief as a party of 6 horsemen emerged from the forest, led by the federal marshal she had heard about during Samuel's escape. Marshal Donovan rode with the weary posture of a man who had spent days in the saddle without finding what he was looking for. His clothes were dusty, and his horse showed signs of hard travel, suggesting that Samuel's deception had indeed led the manhunters on an exhausting chase through the mountains. "Any luck?" Mackenzie asked as Donovan approached the cabin. "Lost him in a storm near Devil's Canyon," Donovan replied grimly. "Crawford's more resourceful than we gave him credit for. Could be anywhere by now." His gaze fell on Elena and Jeremiah. "Who are these folks?" Mackenzie explained the situation, describing Elena as the daughter of a mining engineer and mentioning the suspicious tracks they had discovered. Donovan listened with professional interest, but his attention seemed more focused on the larger manhunt than on investigating 2 apparently innocent travelers. "Crawford's the real prize," Donovan said after Mackenzie finished his report. "He's the one who helped the witch escape. Find him, and he'll lead us to her." Elena felt a surge of hope mixed with concern. Samuel had apparently succeeded in his mission to draw the manhunters away from her trail, but he was still in grave danger. She wanted to ask about his condition, but couldn't risk revealing her connection to him. "What about these tracks?" Mackenzie pressed. "They're fresh, and they lead right to this cabin." Donovan dismounted and examined the evidence himself, but his inspection was more cursory than Mackenzie's had been. "Could be from anyone," he concluded. "Trapper prospector, maybe even one of our own men who passed through earlier. Elena could see Mackenzie's frustration as his concerns were dismissed by the federal marshal. But Donovan's authority was absolute, and Mackenzie had no choice but to accept the ruling. "We're wasting time here," Donovan continued. "The witch could be 20 miles away by now. I want search teams covering the northern approaches to Denver and the railroad at Pueblo. If she's trying to reach civilization, those are her most likely routes." As the manhunters prepared to leave, Elena allowed herself to hope that the crisis had passed. But Mackenzie approached her one final time, his eyes still filled with suspicion. "Miss Whitman," he said quietly, "if you're who you claim to be, you have nothing to fear from me. But if you're lying—" He let the threat hang unfinished, then mounted his horse and rode away with his men. Elena and Jeremiah watched in silence as the manhunters disappeared into the forest. Only when the last hoofbeat had faded did Elena allow herself to collapse into a chair, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. "That was too close," Jeremiah said, his own relief evident in his voice. "Mackenzie suspects something, even if—" "He can't prove it." Elena nodded, still shaking from the encounter. "He'll be back. Once he has time to think about it, he'll realize there are too many coincidences." "Then we need to get you moving again," Jeremiah replied. "But not the way you came. They'll be watching your original route now." Jeremiah disappeared into his cabin and returned with a detailed hand-drawn map of the local area. "There's an old mine road about 5 miles north of here," he explained. "It's been abandoned for years, but it connects to a network of logging trails that can take you all the way to the Denver road without using any of the main passes." Elena studied the map, noting the complex route through terrain she had never seen. "How long will it take?" 3 days if you push hard, maybe 4 if you're careful," Jeremiah replied. "The good news is that it's the last place they'll think to look. The bad news is that it goes through some of the roughest country in these mountains." Elena shouldered her pack, now supplemented with additional supplies from Jeremiah's stores. The old hermit had insisted she take enough food and water to reach Denver safely, refusing her protests about taking advantage of his generosity. "One more thing," Jeremiah said as they prepared to part ways. "When you get to Denver, find a newspaper man named Marcus Sullivan. He runs a small paper called the Rocky Mountain Truth, and he's not afraid to print stories that make powerful people uncomfortable." Eleanor memorized the name, understanding its importance. If she was going to expose what had happened in Millbrook, she would need someone willing to publish her account despite the risk of retaliation. "Why are you helping me?" Eleanor asked one final time as they stood at the edge of Jeremiah's clearing. The old hermit was quiet for a moment, looking out over the vast wilderness that had become his home. "Because I've learned that the difference between civilization and barbarism isn't geography or technology," he said finally. "It's whether people choose to help each other or hurt each other when it matters most." Elena left Jeremiah's sanctuary with renewed determination. She had survived burial alive, manhunters, and the treacherous mountain wilderness. Now she had a clear destination and a plan for exposing the truth about Millbrook's descent into madness. But the abandoned mine road proved to be every bit as challenging as Jeremiah had warned. The trail was barely visible in many places, and rockslides had completely blocked several sections. Elena found herself climbing over massive boulders and through dense undergrowth that tore at her clothes and left her hands bloody. On the second day, she encountered her most dangerous obstacle yet, a pack of wolves that had been driven down from the high country by early winter weather. The animals were hungry and desperate, and they seemed to view Elena as potential prey. For several terrifying minutes, Elena found herself surrounded by grey shapes moving through the trees with predatory intent. She backed against a large boulder, trying to appear larger and more threatening than she actually was. Then she remembered her grandmother's teachings about communicating with wild animals. Elena made the same soft, trilling sounds she had used to call the owls, modulating the pitch and rhythm in ways that her grandmother had taught her expressed peaceful intentions. The lead wolf, a massive male with intelligent yellow eyes, stopped his advance and tilted his head as if listening to Elena's strange sounds. She continued the soft calling, gradually introducing variations that she hoped conveyed respect and a request for safe passage. To Elena's amazement, the wolf pack gradually relaxed their aggressive posture. The alpha male approached within a few feet of Elena, studying her with an intensity that seemed almost human. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the wolves melted back into the forest, leaving Eleanor alone and shaking with relief. The encounter reminded Eleanor that her unusual abilities might be her greatest asset in surviving the wilderness. Whatever had marked her as different in Millbrook could be the key to reaching safety and exposing the truth about her persecution. As the third day dawned, clear and cold, Eleanor could see smoke rising from the valley below, the first sign of human habitation she had encountered since leaving Jeremiah's cabin. Denver was still miles away, but civilization was finally within reach. Elena Hartwell had survived everything that fear and hatred could throw at her. Now it was time to make sure the world knew what had really happened in the mountains of Colorado. Territory. Denver, in the autumn of 1889, was a city in transition, caught between its rough frontier origins and aspirations to Eastern sophistication. Elena entered the bustling streets, wearing her borrowed dress and carrying herself with the confidence Jeremiah had taught her. But inside she felt overwhelmed by the crowds and noise after days of mountain solitude. Finding Marcus Sullivan proved easier than expected. The Rocky Mountain Truth occupied a small building on a side street near the railroad depot, its windows displaying copies of recent editions that featured bold headlines about territorial politics and mining disputes. Elena gathered her courage and pushed through the front door. Sullivan himself was a lean man in his 40s, with ink-stained fingers and the intense eyes of someone who had spent years pursuing uncomfortable truths. He looked up from his desk with the harried expression of a man facing multiple deadlines. "Help you, miss?" Sullivan asked, barely glancing away from the manuscript he was editing. "Jeremiah Moss told me to find you," Eleanor said simply. "He said you weren't afraid to print stories that make powerful people uncomfortable." Sullivan's attention sharpened immediately. "Jeremiah? Haven't seen that old coot in 2 years. What's he gotten himself mixed up in now?" Eleanor took a deep breath and began her story, starting with the drought in Millbrook and ending with her escape through the mountains. Sullivan listened, without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grim as the tale unfolded. "Buried alive," Sullivan repeated when Elena finished. "For witchcraft. In 1889. He shook his head in disbelief. "And you say this Mackenzie fellow is still hunting you?" Elena nodded. "They'll never stop. As long as I'm alive, I'm proof that they tried to murder an innocent girl. They can't let me tell this story." Sullivan leaned back in his chair, studying Elena with new interest. "You understand what you're asking me to do. A story like this would create enemies for both of us. Mackenzie has political connections, and accusing prominent citizens of attempted murder isn't something people forget." "Then you won't help me?" Elena asked, her heart sinking. "I didn't say that," Sullivan replied with a slight smile. "I said it would be dangerous. There's a difference." Over the next 3 hours, Sullivan questioned Elena about every detail of her ordeal, probing for inconsistencies and verifying facts that could be checked independently. His thoroughness was exhausting, but also reassuring. Elena realized she was dealing with a real journalist who understood the importance of accuracy. "I'll need corroboration," Sullivan said finally. "Your testimony alone might not be enough to convince readers, especially given the supernatural elements people will focus on." Elena's face fell. Samuel Crawford was the only witness to my rescue, and I don't know if he's even alive. What about this hermit who helped you? Jeremiah. He only saw me after the escape. He can't testify about the burial itself. Sullivan drummed his fingers on his desk, thinking, what about physical evidence? The grave site, the wooden box, anything that proves your story. Elena's eyes widened as she realized something she hadn't considered. The box. They left it in the ground after Samuel pulled me out. If it's still there, it would be proof that someone was buried alive, Sullivan finished. That's exactly what we need. But recovering the evidence would require returning to the area around Millbrook, where manhunters were still searching for Elena. Sullivan proposed a different approach. He would travel to the burial site himself, accompanied by a photographer and possibly a territorial official who could verify whatever they found. Meanwhile, you stay here in Denver under an assumed name, Sullivan explained. I've got contacts who can provide you with safe lodging and work to support yourself while we prepare the story. Elena felt a surge of hope for the first time in weeks, but that hope was tempered by worry about Samuel Crawford, whose fate remained unknown. If you go to Millbrook, Elena said, try to find out what happened to Samuel. He risked everything to save my life. Sullivan promised to investigate Samuel's whereabouts during his trip to the burial site. 3 days later, he departed Denver with a photographer named James Whitfield and a territorial attorney named Robert Hayes, who specialized in cases involving civil rights violations. Elena spent the waiting period working in a boarding house kitchen under the name Mary Patterson, keeping a low profile while constantly watching for signs that Mackenzie's manhunters had tracked her to Denver. The city's size provided anonymity, but she remained vigilant. Sullivan returned after 2 weeks with news that was both triumphant and heartbreaking. The expedition had successfully located the burial site and photographed the wooden box still lying in the partially filled grave. The evidence was overwhelming. The box showed claw marks where Elena had tried to escape, and its dimensions confirmed that no adult could have survived long inside. More importantly, Sullivan had gathered testimony from several Millbrook residents who had been troubled by the mob trial but afraid to speak out at the time. Their accounts corroborated Elena's story and painted a picture of a community consumed by superstitious fear. But the news about Samuel Crawford was devastating. The rancher had been captured 3 days after Elena's escape and died in territorial custody under circumstances that the authorities claimed were an accident, but that local witnesses described as suspicious. He never told them where you were, Sullivan said gently. Even under interrogation, he maintained that you had died in the mountains, and he was trying to give you a proper burial. Elena wept for the man who had saved her life and paid the ultimate price for his compassion. Samuel Crawford had kept his promise to protect her, and his sacrifice would not be forgotten. The story appeared in the Rocky Mountain Truth 2 weeks later under the headline, "Buried Alive, the Millbrook Witch Trial." Sullivan's careful reporting and photographic evidence created a sensation that spread far beyond Denver. Eastern newspapers picked up the story, and territorial officials launched a formal investigation into the events in Millbrook. Walter Mackenzie was arrested and charged with attempted murder, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. Several other Millbrook residents faced lesser charges, while the town itself became a symbol of frontier justice gone wrong. Elena testified at Mackenzie's trial, facing down the man who had ordered her burial with quiet dignity and unshakable resolve. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges, but perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the personal letter Eleanor received from President Benjamin Harrison himself, who had read about her ordeal. In the Washington newspapers, the president praised her courage and announced the appointment of a federal commission to investigate and prevent similar abuses in the Western Territories. Elena settled permanently in Denver, working as an advocate for women's rights and children's welfare. She never married, dedicating her life to protecting others who faced persecution for being different. Her unusual abilities, once seen as proof of witchcraft, became tools for helping lost travelers and finding missing persons in the Colorado wilderness. On quiet evenings, Elena would sometimes visit Samuel Crawford's grave in the Denver cemetery, bringing wildflowers and sharing news of the changes her story had helped bring about. She had survived the darkness of human fear and hatred, emerging as a voice for justice and compassion. The girl who had been buried alive for being different had become a woman who made the world a little more accepting of difference. In the idea, and that was perhaps the most powerful magic of all. Years later, when reporters asked Elena about her extraordinary survival story, she would always end with the same words: "The real evil was never witchcraft. It was the willingness of ordinary people to destroy what they didn't understand. That's the only curse that truly threatens us all." Elena Hartwell lived to be 93 years old, long enough to see women gain the right to vote and society become more tolerant of those who were different. She never forgot the lessons learned in a wooden box 6 feet underground, that courage can be found in the darkest places, and that sometimes one person's refusal to surrender can change everything. The truth, once buried, had finally seen the light. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.